Hello and welcome back to the Jason Parham Road to the Show on MLB The Show 18. I'm Tyrant Saber. Another season has come and gone in Jason's first full year in the majors, and at the end of September, he and his ball club again find themselves watching the postseason from the couch. It was perhaps a bit much to expect Jason to play October ball, but regardless, I don't think he, or we, could have predicted how his 2020 was going to play out. He started the year with the San Diego Padres, having been demoted from starter to long reliever in the offseason, and was converted to closer in May, racking up 14 saves and 18 opportunities. Then, at the beginning of June, he was traded to the Miami Marlins for shortstop Dave Britt, and given the ace position in Miami's understaffed rotation. In Miami, Jason pitched fairly well, but just before the trade deadline, he was swapped again for a handful of prospects to the struggling New York Mets, who needed a good arm to bolster their own rotation in the face of an injury to Jacob deGrom. Despite that move, Jason struggled in Queens, posting a 2-7 record in front of an anemic Mets offense. The Mets finished their season 72-90, third in the National League West, and so missed out on the postseason. In terms of division winners, the Nationals won the NL East, the Cubs won the NL Central, and the Dodgers won the NL West, while the Yankees won the AL East, the Indians won the AL Central, and, shocker, the Seattle Mariners won the AL West. The Padres finished at a respectable 70-92, and the Miami Marlins finished with an MLB worst 58-104. Your wildcard finishers were the Diamondbacks, Brewers, Twins, and Red Sox. Milwaukee and Boston advance out of the wildcard round to face the Dodgers and Yankees, respectively, while Seattle and Cleveland meet in the ALDS and the Cubs and Nationals face off in the NLDS. Advancing out of those rounds are Cleveland, Boston, Chicago, and Los Angeles, who face off in the ALCS and NLCS, and the pennant winners Boston and Los Angeles meet in the World Series, where the Red Sox win in 6 games. Anthony Rizzo and Mike Trout won MVP for their respective leagues, David Price and Clayton Kershaw won the Cy Young, Corey Seager and Mike Trout had the best batting averages on the year at .316 and .329 respectively. Our relievers of the year were Andrew Miller and Jacob Barnes, and the rookies of the year were the Diamondbacks' starting pitcher Kevin Cabrera and the Twins' catcher Brian McGrath. The Hank Aaron Award went to Mike Trout and Kyle Schwarber, both of whom had 40-plus home runs on the year. Your 2020 Gold Glovers are on screen. The National League had Kevin Cabrera, John Ryan Murphy, Eric Hosmer, Ozzie Albies, Jake Lamb, Orlando Arcia, Marcell Ozuna, Ender Inciarte, and Bryce Harper, while the American League had Mike Leake, Gary Sanchez, Justin Bour, D-Rose Man-Crush, DJ LeMahieu, Brian Dozier, Manny Machado, Andrew Benintendi, Kevin Pillar, and Sean Cortez. Then for the Silver Sluggers, we had Madison Bumgarner, Alex Avila, Anthony Rizzo, Jed Jerko, Travis Shaw, Corey Seager, Christian Yelich, Corey Dickerson, and Kyle Schwarber, while the American League had J.D. Martinez, a designated hitter, Gary Sanchez again, Greg Bird, DJ LeMahieu again, Nick Castellanos, Manny Machado again, Mike Trout, Aaron Judge, and George Springer. In the postseason, your NL MVP was Cody Bellinger, and your AL MVP was Mookie Betts, while the World Series MVP was Mr. Rafael Devers. In the offseason, the Mets got off pretty lightly on retirements. Shin-Soo Choo hung it up with the Rangers, Justin Verlander called it quits with the Astros, John Lester and Pablo Sandoval ended their careers with the Cubs, Brad Hand called it a career with the Reds, and Johnny Cueto ended his career with the Giants. Asdrubal Cabrera ends his career in a poor free agent market, and Pat Neshek ended his due to age. And if you're looking for a specific player in the list, you can always pause and go back to look again. Sadly, though, nobody made it to the Hall of Fame on the first ballot this year. The main move in the offseason seems to have been trading Alex Cobb from the Giants for Phil Fuentes and Jay Bruce, but we also signed a number of free agents. Steven Souza Jr., Cesar Hernandez, JT Realmuto, and Carson Smith. We allowed a bunch of Mets players to become free agents as well. James Paxton's deal appears to have been a short one, so he's off to pursue other opportunities. Other our team standbys Todd Frazier, Matt Harvey, who hadn't been traded to the Reds in Jason's world, Wilmer Flores, Yoenis Cespedes, Brian McCann, Tanner Roark, and Anthony Swarzak. So, once again, Jason stood on no podiums this year, made no postseason appearances, appeared on few All-Star ballots, and when he did, he was a closer, and generally labored in relative obscurity. considering he began the season as a long relief pitcher for the Padres, turned into a closer in May, shifted to being the ace starter for the Marlins in June, then became the number 3 pitcher for the Mets after July. It's probably no wonder people had a hard time pinning Jason in any one category this year. After 2019, it wasn't beyond the scope of imagination that Jay was being thought of as a failed starter or unproven talent. But then he turned into the closer for the Padres, the young ace for the Marlins, then the mid-season injury replacement for the Mets, so his stats are similarly schizophrenic. But before we get to that, how about we talk some more statistics? Yeah, you know you want to know. How about we flip the script and talk about something you don't hear me talking about too much? The offensive stats, or more precisely, the offensive production that Jason allows. Depending on how much you know about baseball stats already, this might be a bit of a recap for you, but allow me a couple moments to bring newer folks up to speed. You probably already know about batting average. This is just hits divided by at-bats. This was the gold standard of measuring offensive production for the last 100 years, and it's not very good at what it does. I spoke a little bit about it in the first bullpen video, but to recap, a hit counts everything that lands fair and doesn't get an out equally, whether it's a 10-foot nubber along the third baseline or tape measure shot into McCovey Cove. Obviously, you'd rather get the latter than the former, but batting average doesn't tell you which you get more of. Also, an at-bat doesn't count the other things that get you on the base paths, like walks, hit by pitches, whatever. So it ignores things that, from a runner's on-base percentage, count just as much as a single for offensive production. So, batting average sucks. What's better? Well, there's also on-base percentage, or OBP. This is a little less picky because it also counts walks and hit by pitches in with the hits, and more or less subs at-bats with the broader plate appearance. This is better from the standpoint of only caring about getting someone on base instead of whether they hit their way on or just walked to first. It's also the sabermetric breakthrough that got the Oakland A's so much attention and notoriety in their Moneyball season. But it still doesn't do much with regard to the whole numbers and homers problem that's inherent to only counting hits instead of what those hits actually were. Going another direction, there's also slugging percentage. This one goes the other direction from batting average and splits the hits out into each category. Singles, doubles, triples, and home runs, and multiplies each by the number of bases each gets you. So you can also represent this as total bases divided by at-bats. This is helpful from another perspective because obviously you want to tell if you're hitting for power, but it also has problems. It ignores walks and hit by pitches just like batting average does, so it still leaves them out of the numerator and uses at-bats at the denominator. There's also a problem when you consider how it rewards the extra base hits. Basically, it assumes that a double is twice as valuable as a single, a triple 3 times as much, and so on. That's kinda true if you're only looking at yourself, but it doesn't consider that there can be other runners on base when you get one of those extra base hits. Depending on what you hit, you might be more likely to drive them in for runs. So, instead of one picky and vague stat, we have 2 stats that have different problems with how they present batting results. What can we do about that? Well, if you're John Thorne and Pete Palmer writing your seminal book, The Hidden Game of Baseball, you stitch them together and you generate yourself a new stat called OPS, on base plus slugging. I really can't make it any simpler than that. You take OBP, you add it to your slugging, and you get another number, OPS. This is, well, just like being mad that your cat can't fetch and your dog can't purr, making a cat dog out of them isn't really the solution here. For one thing, you're counting your hits twice in the numerator, which is kind of like crediting runs to your runners and RBIs to your sluggers. You're getting double credit for the same event, particularly to the guys who had nothing to do with whether people were on base when they hit. For another thing, you're adding OBP, which puts plate appearances in the denominator, to slugging percentage, which has at-bats, which is a mathematical no-no. And in spite of all those new problems you've created, you still haven't actually made your slugging percentage more accurate to the kind of production you get out of your extra base hits. And finally, by adding them together, you're saying that it's equally important to get it on base as it is to knock extra base hits, and believe it or not, that's not true. It's actually more valuable to get on base than it is to hit for extra bases. The stupid thing is, despite all of its warts, OPS kinda works. It correlates pretty well to the number of runs your team gets. The higher your OPS goes, the more runs you score in a linear relationship. Or at the very least, it does a better job than batting average does. But that doesn't mean we can't do better. Sabermetric luminary Tom Tango wrote a book with fellow statisticians Michael Lichtman and Andrew Dolphin called, appropriately, The Book. And while it's kind of dense from a casual reader's standpoint, it goes into the numbers and the weeds to try and challenge the conventional wisdom on all sorts of old baseball chestnuts, like saving your best reliever for a lead in the 9th and getting a save instead of taking on the opposing team's best hitters in the 7th. A lot of its principles undergird the statistics and tendencies of this series, and having read it, I can confidently say I'm never going to bunt with Jason Parham again, unless it's for giggles. But one of the main contributions the book has made is the creation of WOBA, weighted on-base average. Just like the formulas for FIP and WAR, I'm going to spare you the math. What they did was look at each time one of these results happened in an inning, they then found how many runs would later score that inning, for every inning, of every game they could get a hold of. And by doing that, they figured out, using a system called linear weights, that each kind of event was worth a certain number of runs when they happened. So you take each of your offensive events, anything that gets you on base, multiply each by their respective weight, then divide it all by plate appearances. And what you get is something that looks a lot like OBP, but which is a lot closer to how valuable each event is. Most critically, you can see from the WOBA weights that you get almost as much value out of a walk or a hit by pitch as you do out of a single. Not as much, because you can't drive a guy in from second on a walk, but a pretty big chunk. Or put another way, getting to first base is the hardest part of scoring a run. How you get there does kinda matter, but not as much as slugging or batting average would have you believe. And while I've got the book on my mind, you've probably heard me yelling about sacrifice bunting and why it's a bad idea, or heard me mumbling about run expectancy on the mound. To explain these concepts to you, I think it's time for another one of my patented rambling analogies. If you're as old as I am, or older, you may remember the cartoon character Mr. Magoo. If you don't remember Mr. Magoo, he's a stubborn old man with really bad eyesight, and that's all you really need to know about him for our purposes. You can think of him as a cartoon Joe West. Anyway, for the sake of our analogy, let's say that Mr. Magoo decides to go to a baseball game one day, and rather than getting put into the game in a series of hilarious, short-sighted mistakes, for a change, he just peacefully watches from the stands. Thing is, because his eyesight is so bad, he misses out on a lot. He can't make out the faces or names of the players on the field. He can't see the scoreboard, so he has no idea who the teams are, what inning it is, or the running score tally. He can just about see the bases and whether or not there's somebody standing on each base, but with all the action happening on a ball in play, all he knows is where everyone is standing between batters. Let's say that someone sitting near him is enthusiastically tracking how many outs have been called and how many runners have scored in that half inning, and he can hear this person calling out those values. Let's make the assumption that Mr. Magoo, despite his shortcomings, is able to track all the information at his fingertips. He'd realize at some point that there are only 8 ways that runners can be configured on the bases. They can only be on no bases, first, second, or third, or some combination thereof, and there can only be 0, 1, or 2 outs in a half inning. That means there's only 24 possible base states in a game of baseball. You start the half inning with bases empty and no outs, and depending on how the inning goes, you could have potentially anything up to bases loaded with 2 outs. You can empty the bases with a homer and be left with nobody on again, or you can strand them all, but every configuration, no matter how you got there, fits into one of those 24 base states. Let's stretch audience credulity even further and say Mr. Magoo isn't just attentive, he's actually a genius, and he can remember all the base state configurations that happened in that baseball game, as well as how many runs actually came across in each half inning. Energized by his new passion, he abandons his blind misadventures and starts doing this for every game he can, amassing a huge body of data. Eventually he gets the idea, why don't I see if I can find out any patterns from this data, and starts comparing base states to runs scored. Eventually he comes up with this table. What you're looking at is how many runs on average score in an inning from each base state. You start up in this corner at bases empty, no outs. You advance to the right, the more outs you accrue, and you can go up or down the base configurations depending on how the inning goes. If you advance runners and get them to score, great. You turn potential runs into actual runs. But how many runs are you expecting to score after you get those runs in and you get to another base state? This is the run expectancy table. It wasn't drafted by Mr. Magoo, but rather by Tom Tango in The Book, and it lets us examine things like the sacrifice bunt. Let's look at a typical situation. Runner on first, no outs. In a case like this, looking at all the times this situation came up in games from, say, 2010 to 2015, the average number of runs you score from this position is 0.859. That's good! You're really likely to score a run with this configuration. May not happen with the next batter, he might only get a fielder's choice, he might strike out, he might hit into a double play. But when this situation came up in the past, you'd see a run come across 859 times out of 1,000 before 3 outs are recorded. Now, let's look at what happens next. Say the batter decides to execute a sacrifice bunt and he succeeds. The idea is to put the runner on second into scoring position at the cost of putting yourself out so as to make it more likely to score in the inning. Problem is, that's not actually what happens. Looking at the table, you take the configuration, runner on first with no outs, and move it over to runner on second with 1 out. You were looking at an average of 0.859 runs from your previous base state. Now, you're at 0.664 runs. That actually lowered your odds of scoring. You can see how it worked, too. If your next batter, the guy on deck during the bunt, strikes out or hits a can of corn to the outfield or whatever, maybe your guy on second makes it to third, but with 2 outs, your man in the hole needs to hit at least a single to get the guy on third to home plate. The advantages of moving the batter up aren't outweighed by the cost of giving up that extra out. You might still get a run in, but you're less likely to have a big inning, all because you're thinking with small ball and sacrifice bunts instead of trying to do something productive with your bat. The book goes one step further and looks at whether even pitchers, traditionally the weakest sticks in the lineup, should be sacrifice bunting instead of trying to hit the ball. Using its math, they actually determined that even pitchers hitting for their average, about 189 WOBA, produce more value when swinging the bats in a sacrifice situation than they do trying to bunt. In fact, there's only a limited number of circumstances in which sacrifice bunting makes sense for a pitcher, like late in close games or with runners on first and second. Even then, if you're a good hitting pitcher, you can swing away and still be more productive than somebody who drops a bunt every time. Incidentally, while we're on the topic of WOBA and pitchers hitting, you might be interested to know that despite having a lower number of plate appearances on the year, Jason Parham had more base hits and more triples than all the other starting pitchers in the Mets ball club. Good for a WOBA of 230. Not really Mike Trout numbers, and it's not even league average for position players, that's more like 320. But he's adding less negative value with the bat to the team than the other pitchers, in addition to the value he adds with his arm. One pitcher isn't likely to shift the balance all by himself, but if pitchers as a whole start producing better numbers, hopefully that'll keep MLB commissioner and notorious one-minute man Rob Manfred from following up on the perpetual proposal to bring the designated hitter to the National League. Because paying a bad fielder millions of dollars to sit on the bench for 94% of the game is lazy and inefficient from an economic and strategic standpoint. And by gum, that's my position and I'm sticking to it. But that's another bullpen video altogether. Let's go back to Jason and talk about his stats at last. Jason pitched in 33 games for the Padres, and he threw 38 innings for a 3.55 ERA and a 3.69 FIP. He accrued 27 strikeouts, 75% of his 2019 total in something like 60% as many games, and racked up more wins as a reliever and closer in 2020 than he did as a starter in his whole 2019 Major League half season. Then, in his 2 months with Miami, he started 9 games for 56 innings, put up a 3.21 ERA and a 3.82 FIP, and put up another 38 strikeouts against his opposition. Finally, once traded to the Mets, he pitched another 62 innings in 11 starts with a 4.06 ERA and a 4.03 FIP, and hung another 42 strikeouts on the other guys. He also went 2-7 against the Mets' opposition, but 5 of those losses came after allowing 3 or fewer runs. As I've said many times, pitchers only win when their team scores more runs than the other guys, and Jason Parham's Mets did not give him much run support. On the season, Jason finished with a 7-13 record with 14 saves and 20 starts. He pitched 156 innings in total, ending with a 3.63 ERA, a 3.87 FIP, and a 3.82 xFIP between his three teams. Let's also briefly examine his whip totals. 1.05 with the Padres as a reliever, 1.04 with the Marlins as a starter, 1.31 with the Mets as their number 3 arm. I guess those gold glove infielders and glove first outfielders really did make a difference, because even if Jason gave up no walks in his Mets stint, his whip would still have been 1.21. It seemed like there were a lot of balls flying past infielders, and while I know the throwing errors weren't very common, it's tough to look past those at all the good plays that were made. This, incidentally, is why Baseball Information Solutions, Bill James's company, came up with Ultimate Zone Rating, which uses StatCast to tell you which fielders are actually good. MLB The Show does not have this. Let's also compare to last season on some of Jason's stats. In 2019, he had a 6.61 ERA. That came down to 3.63 in 2020. FIP was 6.33, is now 3.87. Whip had been 1.55, it became 1.15. K per 9 had been 4.96, it came up to 6.17. Walks per 9 was at 1.65, it came down to 0.69. His batting average against was 321, it's now 273. Home runs per 9 had been 2.48, that got almost halved to 1.27. Home runs per fly ball was at 20%, it's now 14%. All the trend lines are pointing in the right directions, which is good, and it's backed up by the other statistical affirmation we were hoping for. 755 pitchers played in the MLB in 2017. On average, they pitched 57 1/3 innings on the year, posted an 8.34 K per 9, 3.29 base on balls per 9, allowed 1.27 home runs per 9, and had a 13.7% home runs per fly ball percentage. Their average whip was 1.34, and their ERA, FIP, and xFIP were all 4.36 because league average FIP and xFIP are formulated to be equal to league average ERA. Jason is 1/2 to 2/3 of a run per 9 better than that for his FIP and ERA respectively. His whip is pretty good compared to the league average. His strikeouts per 9 is still not where an elite pitcher's strikeouts would be, but he's improving from terrible to just subpar, so that's something to be happy about. His already fantastic walk rates have dwindled even further. What's probably most important, though, is his drastically reduced home run rates. Jason allowed 18 home runs in 65 1/3 innings in 2019, good for a 2.48 home runs per 9 rate, as I'd explained earlier. In 2020, by comparison, he pitched 156 innings and only allowed 22 home runs for 1.27 home runs per 9. I tried to spare you guys as much math as possible, but because home runs are by far the heaviest weighted thing in the FIP formula, if you can more than double your innings pitched and only give up a few more home runs on the season, your FIP is going to look a lot better in October. It also doesn't hurt that Jason almost tripled his 2019 strikeout total in the same year he more than doubled his innings pitched. Those strikeouts don't weigh quite as much as a home run, but they do tick FIP back down. On the season, Jason put up performances that resulted in him adding 3 wins above replacement to his teams. This is good! Jason was on the wrong side of replacement level last year, so he's improved significantly in just this 1 year. According to the Fangraphs grading scale, he's on the balance point between solid starter and good player, which is probably about right for a number 3 starter for a 70-odd win team like the 2020 Mets. As a result, Jason landed himself a contract in the offseason for $790,000 as a rotation pitcher for the Mets, which, all things considered, ain't bad compared to last year. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some real-world comparisons to what his 2020 season looked like. We'll go with one contemporary pitcher and then one from further back in time. First, we're going to look at Mike Leake. He's presently a 30-year-old pitcher for the Mariners, but he was originally a first-round pick for the Cincinnati Reds, and he started in the majors to begin his first year of professional ball. On his career, he's a 4.01 ERA pitcher, which isn't as good as Jay's sophomore season, but which is still better than Jason's career numbers. His 2017 numbers are about on par with Jason's too, which is why I'm focused on him today. He spent most of his season with the St. Louis Cardinals, but played the last month or so of the season in Seattle. posted a 3.1 WAR rating on the season, throwing 186 innings with 3.92 ERA, 390 FIP, and 391 xFIP. His home runs per fly ball was right around league average, which is why he's so close on the FIP and xFIP values. The thing about Mike Leake is that, like Jason, he's been much more of a contact pitcher than a strikeout thrower. His 2017 K per 9 was 6.29, which is pretty lame by modern MLB standards, but he also only allowed a 1.28 whip with 1.79 walks per 9. In short, Mike Leake is a pretty good modern comp for Jason Parham's 2020 season. He's not an exciting pitcher, he's not a strikeout artist with blazing heat or filthy stuff, but he'll throw good innings, get guys out, and limit runs, and that's all you really need out of a starting pitcher. The other pitcher I'd like to talk about is a guy you've probably never heard of. See, sabermetric pioneer Bill James came up with kind of a frivolous stat called similarity score, and it basically works like this. The closer the two players' box score type numbers are, the more similar they are, and you can use his formula to appropriately weight the difference in their numbers and see how close they are in on-field performance. Bearing in mind, this has nothing to do with a lot of the modern analytics stuff. This isn't a tool to compare player styles or builds or whatever. This is just about the numbers. And I plugged Jason's career numbers into my spreadsheet, and then I compared it to pretty much every pitcher who threw 100 or more innings in the major leagues. Like, ever. It's a list of about 4,700 pitchers, and it encompasses everyone from Cy Young to Clayton Kershaw, and pretty much everyone in between. The only limiting criteria I had was they had to have pitched at least 100 innings. Anyway, I threw Jason's numbers against this list, and then I sorted it to find out who was the most similar based on this tool, and the name I got was Bob Hefner, a man I'd never heard of. He's another Allentown, Pennsylvania boy, a young man who went into the majors and pitched in 5 years for the Boston Red Sox, Cleveland Indians, and what was then the California Angels. He'd thrown 5 years in the majors, but of those, most of his playing time was in Boston between 1963 and 1965. His debut game was a complete game against the Tigers. He gave up 2 homers to Carl Yastrzemski, but those were the only runs he allowed all game, and he even knocked himself a pitcher double in his first at-bat. This is before the AL adopted the designated hitter rule, of course. He was the Red Sox's 5th starter for 1963 and 64, but injuries and poor performances in 65 saw him sent down to AAA, and he only played a few more times in the majors, playing September ball with Cleveland and a few appearances in May of 68 with the California Angels. Hefner's career numbers align nicely with Jason's presently, which is why a big part of why they have such a close similarity score. Bob Hefner had a 4.51 career ERA and a 3.79 FIP, pitched 353 1/3 innings, and gave up 1.59 home runs per 9. We don't have batted ball data that goes that far back, so unfortunately we can't calculate things like his xFIP or his home runs per fly ball percentage. But we can look at some of the other numbers we have available to us. He threw 6.14 K per 9 on his career and had a pretty average 2.73 walks per 9 rating. His career whip was 1.32, and on the strength of his first 2 seasons, Bob Hefner ended his career with 3.5 wins above replacement. Compared to Jason's career numbers, our boy compares pretty favorably, but in terms of career trajectory, getting injured in his 3rd season and not having great numbers thereafter, we would hope that Jason has a slightly better outlook than that. But then again, Jason is on the Mets, so yeesh. Speaking of the Mets, with 2021 spring training over, the 25-man roster for the New York Metropolitans has been settled. Your catcher is JT Realmuto, old buddy of Jason's from the Marlins. The infield is Mason Ibarra, Cesar Hernandez, Eugenio Suarez, and Kyle Seager. Outfield is Michael Conforto, Adam Eaton, and Steven Souza Jr., with Brandon Nimmo at designated hitter. Gavin Cecchini, Jake Marisnick, Kevin Plawecki, and Juan Lagares round out the bench. Then in the bullpen, Jacob deGrom remains the Mets' ace, but with the departure of James Paxton, Jason Parham has now become the number 2 starter, and the rotation is rounded out with Robert Gsellman, Steven Matz, and, rather inexplicably, Chris Flexen, the minor leaguer who previously got incredibly destroyed in his prior outings in the majors. I was wondering why we didn't have Alex Cobb, you know, the guy we traded for in the offseason, in the rotation somewhere, but he seems to have been optioned down to AAA for some reason, and I don't understand why. I mean, yeah, he's 33 years old and a 77 overall, but compared to Chris Flexen, he's an all-star. You have to figure Flexen will either grow quickly or get sent down and replaced by Cobb soon, or else the Mets are looking to have a rough time every 5 games. So that's all I have for you today. On the personal level, of course, I'm still blown away by the level of interest and support I've received over the last few months. Thanks to you all, I'm now over at 600 subscribers, and I'm doing my best to make fun, informative content on a regular basis. You can always make your feelings known by mashing the YouTube buttons below. I'm doing something with this series that you don't see a whole lot of on here, and I hope you folks value that. Thank you all so much for lending your support to Jason Parham as he chases the dream of greatness. He's proven that he belongs in the show, and there's so much more for him to achieve. Here's to a great 2021 season. So until next time, I'm Tyrant Saber, and I will see you at the ballpark.